So, I'll call this meeting of the West Branch Planning and Zoning Commission to order, and we will have the call to order. Now, let's see. Brian, you were going to do that today, right?
Yes.
Roll call.
Commissioner Member Fuller.
Here.
Aspelmeyer. Absent. Peck. Absent. Slaw.
Here.
Walsh.
Here.
Dean. Absent.
Okay, we have a, and yourself?
Here.
Good.
I
We
guess
have-
I should say Dean called and said he may be like have patience issues that took his time, so.
Sure thing. Thanks. Well, we'll enjoy having him here as soon as he arrives. And we have a proposed agenda before us, consisting of minutes, staff reports, and a fair number of things on the comprehensive plan that we've been working on. I'll seek approval of that agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second? Tom? Okay, thank you. All those in favor by voice vote? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. First item is the minutes from our May meeting, followed by the minutes from our June meeting. Are there any adjustments or additions or changes to those minutes, starting with the May 23rd one?
Move to approve.
Move to approve. Is there a second?
So, second.
Second. Voice vote. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay, May 23rd is approved. And then we have the June 20th ones. Any additions or changes or?
Motion to approve.
Okay, and is there a second?
A second.
Okay, all those in favor, voice vote, aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Okay. Now, the comprehensive plan materials that we finally got into you consist of several parts. The group of students and I worked first on the historic preservation plan, and we've got that just about put in order. We expect to have a public hearing on that historic preservation plan on the 1st of August, followed up by an Historic Preservation Commission meeting on the 15th of August, where we'll take into account in between those two times any of the things that were brought up at the public hearing, and add those to the plan or adjust the plan as needed. And then the City Council will be on the agenda for the City Council shortly after that 15th meeting. Well, the reason to bring it to you today is that we've looked at other comprehensive plans, and it's often the case that some of the subsidiary plans are incorporated in those comp plans. And we'd like to do that by making this an appendix to our comprehensive plan. So what I'm seeking is your approval on that. But I think before we ask for a vote on that approval, it wouldn't hurt to have the guy who's been working the hardest on all this, Adam Kofod, share with you some of the materials in that historic preservation plan. So Adam, the floor is yours. Come on
It's
up.
all yours.
In front.
My name's Adam Kofod. I grew up here in West Branch. My dad is over there. I don't know if I've met all of you, but I've at least met some of you living here. It's been an honor to work on the Historic Preservation Commission and like to work on their plan. I guess the best way to summarize what it's about becoming a certified local government. That is a state program where the Historic Preservation Commission will get additional grant funding or matching grants when they decide to apply for a certain project to be reconstructed or rebuilt. It also emphasizes a historic housing program, as we've identified some of the housing stock is older in West Branch, and we could use innovative ways to get people to renovate or rehabilitate their house. It talks a lot about some of the really cool features in West Branch, such as Traveler's Rest, which housed some freed slaves on the Underground Railroad, which is part of John Brown's Underground Railroad route. That's about the best way to summarize it in in 30 seconds, but I'm welcome if you guys have questions or comments on that.
Well, in particular, what this certified local government application will allow us to do, and we're pretty sure that it's going to be accepted when we make it shortly, is to be able to have funds to look at some of the buildings. And what I have in mind in particular is Town Hall. We've talked about renovations to Town Hall for years around here. We've never really done much of anything. This should free up some funds that allow us to investigate putting the Town Hall on the historic register, and then that frees up the possibility of some funding for renovations. So that's what lies behind what we've been doing with this preservation plan. But it also fits with a variety of things. Once until Adam and the others were working on this, and I realized quite the extent of historic stock in the town. And when you think about it, one of the difficulties that you run into is that there is not a lot of housing stock. There's not a good variety of housing stock. And that points to the importance of maintaining what we've got. Mm-hmm. And so it's one thing to build new, and that's great and necessary. But when you've got a 5% vacancy rate, you really have to ensure that your older stock is kept in reasonable shape. And there are some questions about equity and so forth in that regard, in that many of the people in the older housing can't necessarily afford the kinds of renovations that would be to historic standards and would be desirable. So the preservation plan points to the preservation of the historic stock. It points to the importance of housing as an attraction for new people in West Branch, and importance also for what is really our biggest business around here, which is tourism. So all those things come together. They relate to our comp plan in terms of how the comp plan deals with economic development, how the comp plan deals with housing, and how the comp plan deals with recreation. Because among other things, one possibility that Adam pointed out, and I think is well worth investigating further, is a John Brown Trail that would attract more tourism to the city. And so there are all kinds of things that come together in historic preservation, and it fits very nicely, I think, as a part of the total comprehensive plan. So we've got the guy who did most of the writing on this, and if you've got any parts of this you'd like to bring up and talk over with him, we'll of course do more of this in public hearing. The Historic Preservation Commission has been looking through these materials, and they'll get one more shot at it. But I want this commission also to have the opportunity.
I have a question. What is the process of getting a property on the National Historic Register? I mean, is that something that's complicated? Is that involve a lot of entities, or how does that?
The best way to explain it, I guess, I wouldn't say it's overly complicated, but it does require people with experience, and it might take some time for this commission to start accepting locally designated landmarks and getting SHPO's, or the State Historical Preservation's Office, approval. So I imagine the first couple, it might be a lengthy process, but once they are comfortable with it, it would be faster. But generally you would need to do a site inventory form you'd fill out from the state, which talks about like the architectural features or the significant features of the building, as well as
Or its history as a building, and the people who
Would that be
lived in
made
it and so
easier
forth.
because of our existing buildings on the historical register, like that we have existing ones that kind of set the groundwork for that, and then we add to it, or is that something we have to recreate?
I think it probably would be easier, the
Yeah.
fact that we do have historic buildings here. Now, the nice thing is that this Historic Preservation Office actually provides grant support for doing the paperwork and having
Oh,
the
nice.
site visits and so forth. And so that is something
Nice.
that would be triggered also.
And I know many towns in the past for CLG grants, they've used a lot of them for consultants to come in and do the application. So that way you don't have staff members using their valuable time on something that takes a
Got
little
it.
bit of time to do.
And so is that something, say we had a community member that had I don't even know what the qualifications would be for an evaluator. Is that something they have to be designated by the state, or if we had community members that,
It doesn't
in the
have
past,
to be.
I think that's been
And
one
if the commission's experienced enough, we do have an architect on that commission. That can all be done from the commission or
Okay.
from the city as well. So I think it just,
it's not like a special, you have to have this person or that person?
No, although I've seen recommendations from the state office as to which consultants might be
Best.
appropriate.
Okay.
If it's going to be a member of the community, probably it's going to be a volunteer effort.
Right,
And-
right.
And although volunteers are
It's a lot of
wonderful,
work.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I have a family member that did that, yes.
Now this is a historic preservation plan.
Right.
Now, is there a historic district? I mean,
Yes.
is there an actual, do we have an
We've
actual
got a
historic?
map of
It's-
that.
It's just not an overlay.
there's a,
Or is it an overlay, it's not a specific zone? You know what I'm
You're
saying?
talking about, is it a zone of the
Relates to
land use
sign
map?
ordinances.
it's a district and it should be on page 26 if I remember right.
Or 27, or, yeah.
27.
So there's gonna be, if someone wanted to do something to their home in that district, or so forth, would they have to come to the historical preservation?
There aren't any
Committee
homes in that.
or-
These are all
district.
commercial, right?
They're all
These
commercial?
are commercial, but yes, they
But
would
then
have
I see
to.
some homes that were, that
On
were
page
just pictured.
27, I don't think they.
Not on
28,
27.
29 are just 100-year-old homes or high priority buildings that the Preservation Commission identified, but they aren't actual designated landmarks. The only designated one is on that page.
Well, they're
27.
medallion homes.
Those aren't
Yes,
designated.
but they're not designated, so there's nothing
They're
preventing
just for
anybody
identifiable
from.
purposes.
Yeah, but couldn't you go ahead and put an overlay on those?
Well,
properties
that's one of the
without-
things that we
by putting
might want to do.
Yeah, by
Yes.
putting an overlay on, then you wouldn't have to rezone it, so there wouldn't be spot zoning going on.
Right, and we've got a little thought piece about how we would do that and the potential legislation and so forth.
I know that would be easier for 4th through 6th Street, but with the Hoover Medallion homes, they're spread out very far, and so that's where spot zoning, it would be hard to make a legal justification
Right.
on the Hoover Medallion homes themselves if it was a district, because they are like all over the place.
This is what-
That spot zoning could be a huge issue with that. So 4th through 6th Streets would be okay to do that, would be 100% okay, but I think the Hoover Medallion homes are another question based off of the earliest
Yeah.
homes that were built here.
We've identified two sets of old homes, one being the Hoover Medallion ones, and another being all those homes over 100 years. And in both cases, there's historic significance, but not necessarily with every single property. So this is where individual investigations would be needed, and some things might be put on the historic register.
And to clarify, Hoover Medallion homes are homes that were standing when Hoover was the resident here. So it was like 1874 to
1885 or before, yeah.
1885.
And we've talked with the park about resurrecting that medallion mechanism, and they're even willing to provide new medallions and
Oh, great.
providing them to people.
That's great.
But, so, is there gonna be if we're gonna have somebody review, if someone wanted to do something, even to these downtown buildings, is there gonna be a set of rules or a set of standards, I should say? Or is that, we just gonna send everything to the state for approval?
There is a review guidelines in the 1999 Code of Ordinances. It's the very back, but there is a review guidelines where staff and the commission would follow. So it's already in place. Now for houses, I'm drafting stuff for residential, if we moved in the residential, but that hasn't been discussed. But in terms of commercial, there's already review process.
That
It's
sounds
an
great.
existing district.
Okay,
Great job. Thank you for all your,
Yeah, Adam, this was really great.
this is really good, Adam.
Action steps, goals.
Plus, it's kind of cool when you know what when you know the community you're investing in, I bet a
It's-
little bit
it's
better.
been- Yes.
Yeah.
Been very
Wonderful.
helpful.
That's
Wonderful to have
great.
that. And his family's been very helpful.
Right?
I must
Yeah, I
say.
feel like they have a lot to contribute.
Oh, my. So I would entertain a motion to adopt this preservation plan, once it is complete, as an appendix to the comprehensive plan.
I motion that.
Is there a motion? Is there a second?
Second.
And a second. Again, I think voice vote will be fine. All those in favor, aye.
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 Those opposed? Okay, we'll set this one aside and
Great
move
job, Adam.
move to the next. Now, we have two chapters that we want to bring before you. The first one of them has to do with parks and recreation. And I've got two things for you. One is a copy of the Park and Recreation chapter that we had in the earlier comprehensive plan. The second is headed Revision for Discussion. Now, let me just tell you what I'm doing in terms of getting this from the earlier version to something that we can start discussing. And that is, I had two meetings with the Park and Recreation Commission, and they were very helpful. They said that they would like to participate and suggest changes. Then we had a meeting set up last Thursday, and they couldn't get a quorum.
Oh, man.
So they haven't provided anything for me except for something that is their mission statement. And on the revised version, you'll find on the first page their mission statement. Roger's been working on a portion of this with regard to the recreation center, and I think Covey Park also.
Yeah,
Yes, okay.
yeah, I've got it.
And he's already got some handwritten stuff, but we didn't get a chance to incorporate that. So this revision is really not much of a revision, but I'll tell you the areas in which it is worth paying attention to. And that is that we do have a mission statement, and ideally this chapter would be supporting that mission statement. We didn't, in the original plan, have anything in the way of a mission statement. We didn't have any mention of a Park and Recreation Commission. We didn't have a mention of the fact that we have a Park and Recreation Director. And moreover, one of the things that has bothered us as we've been going through this earlier comprehensive plan is the consultant who did this for us never told us where they got their information. So we've had to ferret out that sort of a thing, and it's taken far more time. One of the things I told Adam is that I want to make sure that whatever we do in this revision of the plan has full documentation, so whoever Mac has to do this next time knows where we got all the information.
Right.
And these plans are ongoing. You should really revise them every 5 years or so. Communities change, city councils change, so on and so forth. The world changes. One of the things that Adam and I were talking about is that we really should pay more attention in the housing chapter that we'll get to next about energy matters, because technology keeps moving along. And quite possibly we should be trying to promote new technology for individual housing units for energy. Maybe we aren't there yet, but nonetheless that's something that we should be paying attention to. No mention made of energy at all in the earlier version that we had. There are lots of things that weren't really mentioned in that earlier plan, and we're trying to pick up on with regard to best current practices. So with that said, we're adding some things to the Park and Recreation piece, and one of the things that we want to add once we get information from the Park and Recreation Commission is more about the park facilities that we have today. And of course, we've got more facilities now than we did in 2011, so we're adding those in. We have even the little appreciation park, a private facility, and that's something that we should be making mention of. There was no mention in the earlier chapter of the fact that we've got the whole Hoover complex. But, you know, that really works out to be a facility that is used not only by tourists, but by people who are members of the community. Where do we have our Easter egg hunts and so forth? The fact that we have Easter egg hunts. We have to bring all these things into this chapter. So it's at a very early stage. One of the things that the consultant did was to use criteria by a national association for recreation purposes. Well, we started looking into where the heck they got those criteria. We found they changed, and so we have to change whether or not we adhere with the criteria. And so that's one of the things we're working on. What else? There are some things that we think are worth paying additional attention to. Certainly, we should have some goals, and we should have some actions that can be taken to try and achieve those goals. One of the ones that was in the earlier plan was to have a Friends of the West Branch Parks organization. And I'm not sure what the Park and Recreation Commission thinks of that. The idea is to raise private money to support park programs and so forth. Interestingly enough, just a couple days ago, there was a piece in the Cedar Rapids Gazette about the fact that they'd set up this kind of an organization. It's now been in operation for a year.
Cedar Rapids?
Cedar Rapids Gazette, a newspaper.
What community though?
In Cedar Rapids.
Oh, in Cedar Rapids, yeah.
So they've got one of these kinds of nonprofits, and the article went through how they set it up and what it's been doing and so forth, and it apparently is a very worthwhile part of the park activities in Cedar Rapids. I want to look at whether there are similar kinds of nonprofits in smaller cities and see if we can add that kind of information. Well, that's one of the things that was recommended in the earlier plan, has not been pursued, and seemed worth continuing to recommend. One of the things that's been happening in a lot of communities, although the examples that we have here are bigger communities, is providing two sorts of things. Pocket parks, and we have one of those, which sort of supplement neighborhood amenities. Our little pocket park is one that's by the library, and it's got a shelter, and it's got a picnic table, and not much else. But at least it's something where I've seen kids go out and read their books out there in the shade and enjoy the summer and so forth. It may well be that there are other pocket parks like that that would be appropriate. One of the things that communities have recently started doing is having seasonal little parks taking over several of the parking spaces in a town, in a commercial district. I think that's worth investigating. And nobody wants any parking taken away, obviously, but nonetheless, it makes for a spot where people who are walking can sit down and enjoy being out in the open for a little while. I have in mind that maybe something out by the winery would be worthwhile. These are often financed not just by the city, but also by businesses. And maybe this would be something that would be of interest. So not this chapter.
What would that look like, John?
What it usually looks like, and I've seen these in several cities, is to set aside 3 parking spaces or so, and then some places have little platforms where they put those out, and they have a little fence around them, and they have seating and an umbrella and things like that. And then they're taken down and stored during the winter. So I could see having something like that as an enhancement to the downtown area, and so I think it's worth investigating. And that's all the chapter would be calling for, is paying attention to that kind of a potential amenity as an economic development and as a recreation instrument. So we got that, we started writing that up in here, something that wasn't envisioned by the original plan and by the consultant, and has been taking hold in more communities recently. So I want to get some examples of smaller communities.
Great. And
I have a student who's working on figuring out what these darn things cost. If they're too costly, well, nobody's going to do it, but if it costs $2,000 or $3,000, well, that may well be something that people would be interested in. So I'm waiting on Parks and Recreation to provide me with more information. Roger's providing information, and we're doing some more research to get this chapter in place so that for our September meeting, we can have the full thing to you.
Great.
So, comments, thoughts? Yes, Ryan?
I don't remember if it was previously discussed here or not, but I seem to recall a discussion on trails
Yes.
and potential locations for trails. I wonder if this is an appropriate place to add that information. I
This-
think it already exists somewhere.
This is an appropriate place. There is a slight mention of trails in here. One of the things that I hope to find out from Parks and Recreation is whether the trails plan has been amended in any respect. What this chapter mentions is that we need to coordinate with Cedar County and Johnson County in terms of their trails activities. Roger's already started some of that going on. But there's a need for a network of trails. And that's not just the city, but extending out beyond the city. This is an economic development aspect, it's a recreation aspect, it fits in a variety of different areas. And there's a historic aspect of a John Brown trail as well. So all this needs to come together, and we hope it will as we finish up this chapter.
Well, as we add new developments too, I can
I
target
think
places.
New developments should have trail capabilities so that people can access trails.
part of it that wasn't identified in the, I know I found the appendix to another section which shows the trails plan
Right.
has been created, but I think what's missing from the trails plan that could be either added by this section or the Parks and Rec Commission would be future trail planning, so when the developer comes in, we can identify the routes that we have planned to, you know.
That's exactly what a trails
share
plan
the
really
route.
should be,
If
yes.
if a roadway is planned to be, share the road for bicycle traffic, or if the bicycles are supposed to travel on a trail.
And this is going to resonate with the transportation chapter also, which has to bring out trails, and that's where the complete streets concept comes in. Roger?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. So we'll have a future land use plan.
Oh, yes,
We have that.
we will have,
Yeah, we also have a future trail,
correct. Mhm.
You do.
future trip.
Well, we have one now, but I'm not sure that it's in the
I'd like to
form
tweak
that we like
it
it
a
to
little
be.
bit.
I just think from a developer standpoint, it's fair to manage everybody's expectations about, you know, here's our
That's why
vision.
we need this
Yeah,
plan.
I agree. No, that's what I'm
place
saying.
That we go, 8 blocks out that way, we want a trail, but nobody knows that unless we have a trail plan.
Yeah.
Just, it doesn't have to be specific, but we should.
Well, the
show
less-
Well,
the
the more
trails and lanes.
specific, the better in terms of that
Yeah,
kind of a
probably,
plan, I
yeah.
think. Yeah. So.
Okay.
But, yeah, trails are mentioned in here. There's some mention of coordination with the surrounding counties because, their trails have to fit with our trails. And mention made of a trails plan, but I have to make sure that trails plan is up to date before we encompass that as an appendix like we did last time to the comp plan. So this is just for discussion. I don't need any kind of a vote, just, your thoughts and input.
I agree with Ryan. I think there needs to be a little bit more focus on that, especially as with our lack of sidewalks in some areas of town.
Yep.
The ability to be able to, kids and adults alike, be able to go from one point to another safely on the trails systems, and to manage the developer's expectations of here's what we've laid out. If you're gonna come in, and this is what needs to be incorporated in your plan, and to have some sort of general.
So we keep, yes.
All I was just gonna say is other than the trails information that we're talking about, I thought everything else seems fairly complete. I like the way it's, the old section has been updated, and it seems like it would be easy for city council to reference some of these information graphics and
that's-
what the needs are of the community.
That's something we've got to keep in mind all the time, because we're writing this so that the city council has some guidance. And if they can't pick it up and understand it,
Right.
if it's not written in a way that it's easy to comprehend, then we aren't really doing our job. So we're pointing to that as best we can. Not that they're going to read footnotes or anything, but that's an aspect that leads to continuity and the ability to redo one of these things in the future. Okay, the next chapter that we've worked on is housing. And so if you want to turn to that second page of this sort of overview that I gave you. Housing is kind of a key element of what we do in this town, and for most towns for that matter. And so we picked up on this as the first chapter to revise, to add to, and there are all kinds of reasons to do that. Not just is it important, but also we found that the housing chapter in the earlier plan was darn skimpy. It really didn't do, I think, the kind of job you'd want to have. So you've got something that is 17 pages now in a chapter compared with 6 pages. And those 6 pages weren't necessarily really done as one might wish.
Yeah.
There's an element of what's gone into this that is important, and you remember that you approved a list of peer cities. And so we've used those peer cities, which we think are much more comparable and reasonable and so forth, to be the groundwork for this comprehensive plan. And so I've gone through pages 1, 2, so on and so forth. And if you want to put these two things side by side, I didn't do it in color, I can't afford color. So. But there's the chapter 6 of the earlier plan, you've all got that. And then the chapter 6 of the revised plan. Now we've kept the format, and that's one thing that we've been doing throughout this whole process, because it's much easier to do that. The format generally of the chapters is not bad, except that it's skimpy. And so you'll find the format much the same, and some of the wording is even the same. So you look at this page 25 versus the revision, where my revision went. Just a second here until I... I know I had a... Well, I did have one. Thank you. Not enough copies of these things around.
What does that one look like at the top?
The revision looks like this.
Okay.
And it has a page down at the bottom right that says page 1.
I don't think I have that.
You don't?
Any of us?
I have 2 comprehensive plans, unless I stole one of Terry's.
No, I've got
It
one
should be the last thing you've got, should be this.
Got the old one, but not the new one.
Okay, well, then that is something I did. I've got copies here. In my handing out of copies, I just didn't do the full handing out, sorry.
2 ones, Terry.
Okay, there's a, you have 2 there?
Oh, you got 2 there?
Yeah.
Perfect. I grabbed him.
And,
Yeah, that's the one I have.
I'll just grab them. You can.
these are the,
We got it.
oh my
I
God.
got it.
Okay, so it must be.
confused.
Yeah, this can get confusing. We've got more pieces of paper than I know what to do
Two
with.
of the same ones, three.
Airport.
Yeah, these are
Just
just,
two sides.
yeah. This is the old one.
So now what we have is the 2 chapter 6s side by side.
Chapter 6.
That's like one of those ends.
Chapter 11.
We'll get it worked out. So my notes suggest if you put these first pages side by side, you won't see a pretty picture on the right-hand side.
Oh, you have that. Is that it?
That's the old one.
Do you have the old one?
Yep, I do.
Okay, good. You won't find a picture on the right-hand side. We couldn't figure out exactly why that was there, and so we removed it.
That's the back.
The revised chapter states that we're going to include a variety of potential policy and program changes to be considered by the city council. So in many respects, that first page doesn't differ an awful lot from the earlier work that was done. It does include the smart planning legislation, which is still alive and worth noting. As we turn to the second page of each of these things, we find that it's headed Characteristics of the Existing Housing Supply. And so these tables and Adam can help me out on these because he's been working on these tables, shows the assessed value and the housing by year built. So here's information for West Branch. Now, the earlier work used the census for 2010 as a base for what it did. We don't have that same kind of information. We don't have a census for 2020, and moreover, the census has been changed in a variety of ways. So what is replacing the census is called the American Community Survey. And this is, there are more estimates in that, and so it's not as accurate as the census. But on the other hand, it's up to date. So we have used the American Community Survey as a basis for what we've done. And Adam, the 2015 is the latest data that we have from ACS. So that's what we have here, information for the most recent period. And so we've got assessed value, and this is given by the number of units in different price categories, assessed price categories, and you can see what the spectrum of housing is like in our city. And then we have the year built information and the percentages of the 1,100 or so units that we've got in our town. Let's see. We have some conclusions, and one of the things that we recommend is really over on the next page, 3, which is that we need to pay more attention to constructing rental units. So we can see that the vacancy rate in West Branch, as we turn from page 2 to page 3, the vacancy rate is really darn low. You found that out, didn't you? Looking for houses and so forth around here. It's quite a chore, and I'm sure you run into this all the time. So on page 3, we'll see that we suggest paying attention to trying to accord with our peer city median percentages for vacancies, and encourage new rental housing in particular. Not that we don't want to encourage all kinds of housing, because after all, that's important to maintain diversity of housing. It's important to have move-up housing that people can change from one unit to another, not have to go out of town for that. And it's important to have a variety of rental housing options available as well. Adam, do you want to add anything to his first few pages?
Yeah, I think it's important for the low rental rate. It's 3 percentage points lower in West Branch than the median peer city. And to put into mind how fast Tiffin has been growing lately, 31% of their housing stock is rentals, and it's only 20% in West Branch. So I'm not saying we need a whole bunch more rentals, but the city will still be able to grow if rentals are constructed. So
I think that's an important question that I maybe have posed once to one developer when we've been chatting with them, is the covenants of a particular building may indicate that the units are able to be rented, and they may indicate that they're only to be owner occupied. So those are kind of questions that I think we should consider when we're considering conversations with developers. But also, to piggyback off that a little bit, one of the things that Tiffin does a really good job of as well, being in the real estate industry, is there's home ownership programs that promote home ownership in rural areas, like rural development through the USDA or the Iowa Finance Authority, that particularly those programs wouldn't be Iowa City or Coralville eligible. They would be outlying communities to promote home ownership. And there's certain housing types that are allowed to be broad under those programs. And so those are also things that are helpful seem to become more affordable options for families. And as the builders come in and build, the developments continue, those are things that I think we should look at in general to kind of questions to ask.
Let me page back for just a second to the Historic Preservation Plan. One of the things that Commission and our discussions have led to is that we really need to do more in terms of grant-seeking activity for the city. And that's related to what you mentioned with housing. It's related to energy grants and so forth as well. And so one of the recommendations in the Historic Preservation Plan that we'll pick up on in some part of our comp plan is a recommendation that we do our best to see that some of the city staff receive training in grant writing and grant seeking. That's hard to do with a small community, but and we do have our Main Street person who has some of those kinds of capabilities. But having that reside in the staff by having some explicit training seems important, and so that resonates with the housing chapter,
Right.
economic development, all kinds of things. But just wanted to mention that.
Yeah.
So Adam, anything else, or are we finished with page 3?
I have a question. I'm just
Yes, sir.
curious, really curious. Why is there a percentage of renter occupied versus, why is it, if we're 100%, if a town is 100% owner occupied, is that a bad thing? Is say 20% renter occupied?
Well, I think from a affordability standpoint, not everybody can afford to be an owner occupant, and there's portions of the community and the socioeconomic.
You get a wider variety of.
You
Yeah.
do, and if you had 100% owned houses and so forth, although some of those could be rentals, you wouldn't be serving a portion of the community. Think of new high school graduates and getting their first job, or college graduates,
No
whatever.
place to go.
Think of elderly people who don't want to take care of a house but want some kind of a condo or an apartment or what have you. So you need a diversity of housing stock in your community in order to serve a diverse population. And I don't think most cities really want to have just one segment of a population living in them. And when you start having just owner-occupied housing, it cuts the diversity of
One of the
your
thoughts
people.
with that is you get, everybody's vested in their home.
Yes.
Pride of
Care about
ownership.
their own
Yeah.
home. I don't know why I bring that up, that's just why.
Well, and there's, so like the 24-plex or 12-plexes, for example, talking about the covenants, sometimes they'll be blanket, they can all be rentals, sometimes they'll be blanket, they all have to be owner occupied. And sometimes, and this is where it comes into qualifying for the USDA or those types of rural development programs, is that in order to qualify for those programs, a condo association has to have a certain percentage of owner occupied units and a certain percentage of rental units within the building itself. And that's so that the value can continue, because there is pride in ownership and they have those kind of requirements. Yeah, so, I don't know, that's a good question.
And that's something that Iowa City has been hanging up much more recently.
A lot.
And in particular, requiring some developments to have a low-income housing. So
Units within it, yeah.
we didn't touch on that topic per se, but I think that one of the things we'll want to do is to pick up on the covenant question and maybe do some revision.
Because I think Tiffin does, like Tiffin's a great example, but they do a good job of having being able to have housing units that qualify for all those different programs, because North Liberty unbelievably still is considered a rural development eligible
Really?
community.
How about?
And Tiffin is right now, but both of them soon enough should be not, in my opinion. And then we would be one of the closest communities next to be in that consideration. I mean, we are now, but with those two off the plate. So I just think it's definitely something to consider when you're.
Well, thanks, well worth it. Ryan?
I had two comments on this section. The first is a follow-up to this discussion. Is there any guidance on the, I guess, the percentage that would be desirable or
Rentals?
percentage rental properties within a community that would
A good dynamic.
What's the best balance of rental to owned property? I don't know that it probably varies depending on what you want your community to look like.
I think it does. What we've been doing is saying that there's some degree of guidance from the peer cities that we've picked up, and that most of those have a higher proportion. But I don't know. Adam, in your housing research, have you run across any?
I was gonna say a factor of housing is preferences, it's not all of it. So there might be a higher preference for rentals in, you know, different parts of the country as well as cities. But I think the best way to look at it is to look at the peer cities, which have similar size, similar economies. They're located next to Interstate 80, just like West Branch. So they're at like 23%. So it's like 3 percentage points, which isn't terrible.
very
It's not
much.
that far off, but it does suggest there could be some encouragement of more rentals here in West Branch.
One of the useful things that Adam has done has been to forecast in relation to our population the demographics of the community as time goes ahead. And it does appear that we're going to have a different demographic, which is going to be more attuned to rentals. It's elderly, it's young, it's lower income, and so forth. And so if you look ahead to 2025, which is kind of what we're doing, then you see that as you forecast ahead, that percentage increasing would be desirable. But it's not a huge gap or anything. It's just that it's going to be a growing gap.
In comparison, yeah.
Yes.
And my second follow-up is, obviously I didn't read this word for word yet. I was looking for, seems like this would be a good place for reference to our pending historic preservation plan. Is that not included yet, or has that been included in this housing section at all?
When it comes to maintenance of older housing, it is referenced, but in terms of rentals, or what are you thinking should be referenced?
I guess I'm just assuming, I was looking at those sections on the older maintenance, and it seemed like that would be a good place, probably just a reference with
We tried to.
the appendix, when it becomes an appendix.
Yeah, specifically to the appendix, okay.
As like a reference saying this is a resource available for homeowners within the
Good
city
point.
that are looking for.
Yep, we didn't do that because we didn't
It's not in there.
Not in
include
there
it
yet.
as an appendix until tonight. So, oh, my.
Yes.
Well, let's see, I think we've made it all the way to
Sorry.
page, no, this is exactly what we need to have. Made it all the way to page 3 of the new one. And then moving on to page 4 of the new version. And page 4 has a figure there, and when you see it in color, it's a better one. And that relates to page 26, and it shows the owner-occupied, the renter-occupied, and the vacant units that we have versus both the comparable cities and the peer cities. In fact, we should probably start using the word peer cities everywhere,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
It's, when we first wrote it, it was comparative cities, but then peer cities fit in the graphs better, and it was median peer city that we were looking at.
And when we started off, we didn't have that set of peer cities agreed upon either, so anyway, we'll call this peer instead of comparable cities. And then we have the state average. Now, by average, are we talking about the median or the?
The actual state, so it sums up the
No,
whole
is it the mean,
state.
is it the mean or the median?
It's not really the mean or median, it's the exact state number, so it has the
We've
amount
got
of
it numbers and the
number of
percentage.
Okay. Then let's make sure we say that this is number of. Okay. Keep revising as we go along. So we have the new figure in there, and it shows that, I think it shows reasonably the differences between West Branch and our peer cities. And as I stated in my little notes, it needs a better caption, so we've now got a better caption. And then this page also discusses the HUD standards for vacancies. And so this is what it's what is brought out and it's based upon. Now the earlier one I think did it refer to HUD standards, Adam, in the earlier version? I don't think it did. Oh, yes, it did on page 27. But it wasn't
Yeah, it did.
wasn't sourced. So,
Based on the HUD standard definition.
yep. Now, one of the things about this American Community Survey is that the
Imagine if
several,
we had 49 housing units available for sale in this town. That'd be good.
yeah,
Option.
it would be if there were that
Right.
number. Get some new construction going in here, and we will have. But one of the interesting things is that the past American Community Survey information showed far fewer rental units available. Like before 2013, there were 0. And so you have this variance from survey to survey to survey, and we at least report that. Okay. Then I'd like to turn to page 28 of the earlier one. And there you had two different tables. There's one on the status of housing units, and then there's one on the deed transfers for a particular year. What we have instead is a large table 6-4 that has status information that has all of our peer cities in it. And then it also has the median peer city and the state. So I think that's a more comprehensive and useful table than what we had before. I don't know that deed transfers in any particular given year is especially worthwhile, so we eliminated that table.
One of the issues I can tell you with Cedar County particularly is they're about 6 months behind on their recording on
Deed transfers?
deed transfers,
Yeah.
online at least. And so it's really difficult. Sometimes it takes, especially during tax time, they're months and months lagged from recording, what's
Gotcha.
actually been recorded to what shows when you pull it up.
So is it reasonable to eliminate that table?
I think so.
I think
I don't think it's reliable enough of a source.
If it's not reliable, I don't really want to do that. So, okay, that I think takes us to page 29 of the earlier one. And that has a statement about maintaining housing diversity, which we don't think is a bad statement, but essentially what we've done is to pick up on that statement elsewhere and added a lot more information about diversity. It also says that promoting single-family detached housing that's moderately priced is to require some effort. Well, I think that's that has required some effort and has really happened. And then there's a little piece that says we should be respecting the natural environment and having low-impact design. So these are things that we then elaborated on in the pages that follow, and it's one reason why this is lots more pages. So the first thing we elaborated on was to add a piece on mobile homes or manufactured housing. Nothing in that earlier plan about this. And one of the things that we picked up on, and we have to verify that this is still the case, is that the emergency warning system we have for
I think they
tornado.
installed one out there, didn't they?
Pardon?
Did they install a separate emergency tornado warning whistle out there, or no?
For
For the trailer court?
Trailer court.
I feel like they did, but maybe not.
Well, we've got to
But
make
that's
sure
def-
that,
yeah,
if
check.
that's been
Verify.
if that's happened, that's
I
great.
don't know where that one on that side of town is.
I
really don't know.
I feel like they added one because of previous concerns, but we'll have to verify that.
Okay.
I may be wrong.
Well, one of the things we found is that that mobile housing is about 15% of all of our housing. And I hadn't realized it was, I didn't know what percent it was, but it's a fairly substantial part. And so we should be paying, I think, more attention to that.
Probably because it's affordable.
And, well, yeah, it of course it's more
I mean,
affordable.
In
Yeah.
terms of, yeah.
And so if we're going to add to our affordable housing stock, maybe renovations and so forth, there should be taken into account. If you have any thoughts, because this is kind of a skeleton section, we'll check out the part about whether there's been an addition to the emergency warning system. But if you have any other thoughts, that would be worth knowing.
Well, I think if you're talking about housing with the mobile homes, when you're talking about housing, if you're looking at it just from number of units and the types of units, that's one thing. But mobile homes are personal property, so they don't generate any sort of property tax or
No, just on the
anything.
site.
Right,
Yeah.
so just depending on what you're looking at. But for this purposes, I think it works well.
So we have that. And then if we turn to page 7, page 7 going here. It relates to page 29 about floodplains and the quality of life and so forth, and it brings out a full section on housing and the natural environment. One of the things that is mentioned in there, and I know I had an earlier paper for you about it, is restoration of topsoil. And we figured that although that should be mentioned in this chapter, that's something that really goes into the chapter on the environment. And so we'll bring it out there, see what you folks think of it, and have that as an element. There's been a lot of attention paid to topsoil elsewhere in eastern Iowa, and so referencing that and so forth, I think is worthwhile. Whether the city council wants to do anything about it, that's up to them. But bringing out the matter, I think, is worthwhile, and especially in a town that has flood issues and so forth. Plus, in the long-term life of dwelling units, it does make a difference whether or not you have reasonable topsoil. As I mentioned to Adam, I've been putting in compost in our clay area for years now, and finally it got so I can grow stuff.
Yay.
But, it's something that is worth paying attention to. There is an illustration on page 30 in the earlier plan. Does anybody know where this is? So there's a house, 2 houses there on some street.
They're
That's a Hoover Park.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
But
they're right down on Poplar Street or whatever it is, going the other way.
Well, that's fine, but it doesn't fit here. I mean, if we had some historic houses or a new development or whatever, that would be, I think, much better. So we'll make sure we take this picture out and get something in that's more up to date. Pages 9, 10, and 11 are additions. And they're additions that have to do with affordability and rental prices, the forecast that Adam has made, affordability for youth, affordability for elderly people, and a set of possible actions that you'll find on page 12. So, Adam, do you want to explain a little bit how you did this? And one of our challenges is making sure that we can explain the forecast to the city council,
Right.
which doesn't specialize in forecast. So the wording is going to be worked on more, but
yeah,
go ahead.
to break down a forecast, it is the best or most likely projection based off of past patterns. So what I did for affordability, I noticed from 2010 to 2015, I don't have the numbers on me, but there's a huge spike in renters who are cost burdened every single year. So it was a pattern that I knew was starting to become serious. If it was just 1 year, it's probably just a sampling error. But it consistently went up. And by cost burdened, we mean you're paying 30% or more on housing.
These are HUD standards, and we reference where you get this information, and there's both.
Nationwide or is
cost-
that?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's
Nationwide.
The standard is nationwide, but he's saying what he thought.
Standard is
But
nationwide.
the income figure is local. So it's 30%, over 30% for our local income.
Yes.
Distressed.
Over your.
Well, there's two elements. One's cost burdened, and then there's heavily cost burdened.
Okay.
That's just the terms that are used, but and then that's based off of your median income. But to determine forecasts, there are like a set of 7 different formulas that I use, and it uses all this data from the previous 5 years, or it could go even further, but I looked at 5 years because this is when it's just started to happen. And I run these formulas, and it measures these formulas based off of what has already happened in 2010 through 2015, and then projects it all the way to 2025. So when you think of trends, sometimes it could be a straight line. So some of the formulas are basically a straight line. Some of them have plateaus, some of them spike up. So in this case, the most accurate projections in terms of what had happened in the previous 5 years was the Gompertz formula, which we won't go into details about, but basically it plateaus at the top. And that's probably what will happen. You're not going to have an increasingly amount of renters in West Branch if the population isn't even growing that fast. So basically it doesn't mean that's what's going to happen, but basically based off the past 5 years, if that trend continues and based off of these formulas, this is the most likely, most probable scenario.
So what you've heard is a distillation of Adam's first year of courses in forecasting and housing.
Well, you're
And he's learned a lot, I must say.
45%
Yes.
in 2025.
If I didn't,
Can't be right.
no, that's where it was crazy. If I would have done a straight linear, it would have been like 200%, because that's how much it's changed in the last 5 years. That's why a linear projection would not be accurate at all.
So this whole section on affordability leads from the idea that we should have a diverse capability to handle a variety of people. And it's something that wasn't at all in the earlier plan, and it's something that draws upon HUD standards, draws upon some forecasts, draws upon the expected incomes and so forth of the population here. So it's pointed towards West Branch. It's alerting people that things are going to get worse if we don't do something. And if we want to maintain diversity in the community, then we're going to have our housing stock adjust in accord. And then we have, given those forecasts and so forth, on page 12 we have some possible actions. So these are things I think you should take a look at, think about more, and see if it does make sense. Because these actions include aging in place, either renting or...
One of the highest scoring
Pardon me?
sections. I mean, the aging population. I mean, that
Yeah, that's
one
of-
level living, that kind of stuff is
Yep.
really
Or granny flats. for that
granny
matter.
flat, and they're not addressed. I don't think as much as they should be as high.
No, they were
as they're
not
growing.
even brought up in the earlier plan, and it would take some adjustment and some changes in our ordinances. But at any rate, it's something to put before the council. It's something for us to consider more fully. And the second one is about making rentals or innovative housing options easier or less expensive to develop. And then the third is to reduce the minimum lot size requirements, something that I know Chris has considered and talked about. And third is to update our land use map to pay attention to the need for rentals and duplexes and so forth. The next is to consider more condominiums. And the last relates to this point I was making earlier about grant seeking, and it's to encourage CDBG grants and rural housing grants that you've just been alerting us to. And interesting to realize that some of those peer communities, surrounding communities, are going to be moved out of those granting opportunities.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
this gives us an additional
And not too much
possibility.
further.
So all these actions are related to the diversity side of things. So don't have to comment now, but look forward to comments. And then we end this with something that likewise was not really in the earlier version, and that is housing goals and some suggestions about, in the very last page, suggestions about what we would like to be doing. So these goals are in relation to older housing, and that resonates with the historic preservation plan. And then in terms of something that was not brought up in the earlier plan that I recall, and could go into the environmental plan, but seemed to be worthwhile bringing out here, and that is lead exposure and energy expenses for older units. A lot can be done with regard to insulation, a lot can be done generally with older housing. And then the third major one is to look at aging in place ownership and rental options. So these are developed, we have a little bit of information. For example, I was surprised to see for the houses built before 1980 how large a likelihood there is of lead-based paint in those.
Prior to 78.
I might also suggest, with the consideration for lead exposure, also asbestos exposure.
Yes.
I know aging houses would probably have large amounts of asbestos in
I
it.
was just in one in town the other day that was very clearly, it was showing a house that's old, one of the most
Right.
Siding or?
wrapped downstairs on the pipes.
Insulation.
Pipe insulation.
Schools.
It was right next to, that's.
I
Wheeler's
have
old
to
place.
remember my grandmother using these asbestos pads in her kitchen.
Oh, God.
Yes, exactly. As they frayed over
Yeah.
time and so forth.
Or even those
Lucky I
tiles
still
when
have
they're
lungs.
chipping up, you know, the
Well,
old,
they're fine until they start chipping.
right,
Yeah,
right.
tile,
Or somebody doesn't
flashing.
know and they start,
Well, let's make
remodel.
sure that we investigate that.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Then we have a set on this page 16, last page here, a set of points that we should be paying attention to. And those are just, well, you can read them over, see what you think. And I'd like to raise a question of some sort of a housing task force or commission. Is that something you think that West Branch is ready for, could utilize, would find helpful in any respect? And maybe I should ask Roger that question more than anybody else. What do
Where
you
would they
think?
fit in the whole,
Pardon me?
where would they fit in,
Well,
Seems like a good side by side with the economic development committee. I mean, this is something that they could
They have a
benefit
set
each
of
other.
goals or agenda achievements to, I'm not sure what the purpose would be.
well, that's why it says investigate.
yeah.
I'm not sure
A
either.
housing committee or something.
Yeah. A housing task force, housing commission.
If their purpose was to encourage the type of housing that it's been determined the West Branch needs, then their best tool to do that would be the economic development group to try and encourage development
Mhm.
and the type that they need. Seems like that would be a
Well, if we have this as a goal over the next 5 years or so, it would seem to me that we could start getting into the question, are these kinds of groups or organizations something that other small communities have? What do they do? I mean, we don't want to
Right.
necessarily go by what Iowa City does. We want to look at smaller communities. And so, as Roger says, what's their purpose? What could they do? Could they fit into economic development? I think there are unanswered questions, and all we say is this is something that
Mhm.
probably needs some
Finding
attention.
ways, sorry, go ahead.
No, Chris?
Roger, you had that committee talk about that building incentive, housing building incentive program, so then you have a few people that you pulled together.
That was pretty focused on
Kind of come up.
creating an incentive to build. That was, and then we kind of disbanded. That was a
Right, but
pretty
then
focused
there's,
group.
yeah, so you could do special interest.
Well, I was just about to say, we have a number of 100-year-old homes that need to be rehabbed.
Yep.
If we could have a little group together to help find ways to.
Or there might be some of those housing units, like the one up here that's
Incentivize.
appropriate for a multifamily. Maybe you can create 2 rental properties in one, I mean, depending on the property and what it is. But I think like the incentivization was to encourage development, but we're kind of dialing down a little bit more than that, like yes, you can build here, but here's what our needs are.
I'd like to see us dress out Main Street a little bit, just, we have some really crappy houses on Main Street that look like crap. I'd like to see if we find a way to get those fixed up.
Well, I don't know that we've fully picked up with that last page on the revitalization of older housing part. So I think we need to add another bullet point down there with regard to seeking ways to revitalize our older housing. So, well, this is where we're at. And
Good stuff, very good stuff.
yeah, I think we've made quite a reasonable amount of progress.
Absolutely.
But there's more to be done, and we'll pick up on the comments that you provided. We'll get this in a revised form so that we can bring it to the September meeting.
Yeah, I could add more examples of like housing task force that other small towns can do. That way there's a little bit more explanation in there. But I think one way to see it is addressing and incentivizing rehabilitation, but also one thing that I found really important working in another small town in southern Iowa, Bloomfield, is they're really good at getting grants. If one of these people on this housing task force knows how to write grants or has grant writing training, then that brings more access, whether it would help the Meadows put 2 affordable housing units in it because they had CDBG grants, or whether it's rural housing grants. But if you have someone that specializes and knows how to do this, you're going to be able to take that grant money that other people don't even try to apply for. Or, you know,
I think we have a good pocket full of people that have those capabilities.
Well, as I look more broadly at other communities, I find a lot more grant seeking going on.
No, I mean, people that have the ability to seek them out,
and so I think that is something that needs to be pervasive in this comprehensive plan, but every time we have the opportunity, we ought to
Right.
seek to have financial
Got a
support.
specific skill, I mean, a grant writing.
Yes, it
Yeah, it
is.
is.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know how to do it. I've never-
No,
And you have to know how.
Adam is taking a course in it right now, as a matter of fact. So-
Run, Adam, run.
I have a PhD to write.
No, you don't have to have a PhD, but what you have to do is be able to see others' grants that have been written that have been successful.
And know what patterns, yeah.
And you have to know the granting organization and what they're looking for, so the criteria.
people review them,
Yeah.
things like that.
So, yeah, it is a specific skill, and it's something that can be obtained. So, well, I'd like to turn to the very last page of my notes here, and where it says, "What's next?" And we are continuing to work on the Parks chapter. I hope that input from Park and Recreation. And we're going to next, and we'll make the revisions to this chapter on housing. The next chapter that I want to work on is Chapter 4 on the community profile and character, update that, and be able to have that before us at our next meeting. Different list of peer cities and so forth, and so that has lots of changes that has to be made. Now, and this is where I'm calling on the staff. There is a Chapter 12 on public and community facilities and finance. So I need some input. And so, Gordon, you're reading this, right? I need some input from a finance standpoint. And I think the thing to do is to look at the earlier chapter and see what it had to say, Chapter 12. And then I'm going to need input from Nick on the library and where we're at with its facilities. I'm going to need some input from the fire folks on whether the fire station section is correct. And there's nothing mentioned about the police department in the earlier version. So I'm
Nothing
going to
at
need
all?
some.
Nothing at all.
Not a darn thing that I could find.
Wow.
So we really need to pay attention to that. And then the capital improvements plan and its planning process, that's something that we put in place after the first plan, but it certainly wasn't described in that earlier plan, and no attention really was made to the capital improvements plan. So we need to update by adding that. And to the extent that city staff can work on these matters, then we could have that before us in our September meeting. So we'd look at revisions to Part 1, we'd look at Chapter 4, we'd look at Chapter 12 in the September meeting. Adam?
Yeah, I just want to end before you adjourn, because we never explained the specific reason why renters are having a harder time now in the past 5 years. I've done a couple of housing needs assessments, so I was able to look at a lot of data and try to summarize what's normally a 70-page document into that like 5 pages on affordability. But what I was able to determine is there's been a huge increase, like roughly 40% of the new population growth in West Branch have been individuals aged 25 to 34, so it's like 119 people. And now that group earns less in 2015 than they did in 2010. They have more dependents, and I was able to determine that by how the population has changed in rental units. And they are demanding rentals in larger 12plexes, and at the same time, we have an aging population which is all competing over this rental market. So rents has increased by 10% in the last 5 years. And due to the limited amount of rentals, seniors are also staying in their houses. So West Branch does have a high cost burden rate for
Senior
homeowners.
homeowners.
Seniors.
Yeah.
Without a mortgage. So there's just a lot of competing. The supply increase isn't quite with the demand increase, and that's why over the last 5 years it went from 37 cost burden renters to 57, and now that's why it's projecting this huge spike if that trend continues.
And Roger, you've mentioned need for an RFP for the cement plant area. I think we've got a wonderful opportunity in town to pay attention to some of the information that Adam has produced for us in the way in which that particular site is developed. And it's walkable, it's nearby, it has all kinds of important elements that would fit trying to provide diverse housing for the future population. So I think this is some degree of guidance that would help us as we look at the kinds of proposals that are made for that area.
Well, we'd like to get a request for proposals out sometime by the end of the year, I think. Request for proposals for that site.
Well, you'll have the housing chapter certainly, and
Input.
to the extent that that can provide input to the ideas for RFPs, that would be great. Okay, well, this is where we're at, and we keep plugging away day after day. Adam is in every day working away early in the morning, most every day, not every single one. And and I'm working with him, and Abdullah is helping out as well. So we're going to see out the summer, doing as much as we can, and then proceed on into the school year. I'd hoped that the end of the 2017 year would see an end of this, but we may move over into the next few months a little bit. So I think that's it. Is there any staff information that we should know about in the way of staff reports? Or any other comments from
I have
folks?
nothing.
Okay. If there's nothing, then I'll entertain a motion for adjournment, and we'll get back together in September. Ryan so moves.
A second.
There's a second. All those in favor, voice vote. Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.